What if one of the biggest spiritual revolutions in modern history did not begin with a new religion, or a new prophet, or a new sacred text? What if it began with something far quieter than that? A breath, a pause, a moment of attention. For thousands of years, spirituality was often centered around belief, ritual, scripture, authority, tradition, and belonging to a community that gave shape to the sacred. But in the modern world, something changed. Increasingly, people began looking for a spirituality not only in churches, temples, mosques, synagogues, monasteries, or sacred doctrines, but in direct experience, in awareness itself, in the simple act of noticing. And mindfulness became one of the great doorways through which that shift occurred. Today, I want to explore how mindfulness changed modern spirituality, what it opened up, what it transformed, what it made possible, and perhaps what it also left behind. Because mindfulness did not just become popular, it changed how millions of people understand the spiritual life. For much of history, spirituality was usually inherited before it was chosen. You were born into a tradition, you learned its symbols, its stories, its practices, and its worldview. Spiritual life was often communal, structured, and guided by established forms. And that gave people many beautiful things: depth, meaning, belonging, continuity, and reverence. But modernity changed the landscape. Science challenged old certainties. Pluralism exposed people to many traditions at once. Individualism encouraged people to ask, what do I actually believe? And skepticism toward institutions made many people hesitant to hand over spiritual authority too quickly. Into that changing world came mindfulness, and mindfulness offered something incredibly compelling. You do not have to begin with belief, you can begin with attention. You do not have to solve the entire mystery of existence first. You can start by noticing your breath, your thoughts, your suffering, your habits, your reactions, and the quality of your awareness right now. That was revolutionary because it moved spirituality for many people from what must I believe to what can I directly observe. From our outer authority to inner examination, from doctrine first to experience first. And to be clear, mindfulness did not invent inner awareness. The contemplative traditions of Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Sufism, Taoism, and others had long cultivated forms of attention, silence, prayer, and presence. But mindfulness entered modern culture in a very particular way. It became a bridge between ancient contemplative wisdom and modern psychological language, a bridge between spirituality and science, a bridge between religious seekers and people who no longer felt at home in religion. And that bridge changed everything. Mindfulness spread so powerfully because it met a modern ache. People were overwhelmed, distracted, anxious, fragmented, exhausted by speed, noise, and mental overload. And mindfulness seemed to offer something simple, immediate, and practical. A way to come back, a way to steady the mind, a way to suffer less, a way to live with more presence. And it did something else that was especially important. It translated spiritual practice in a language that modern people could hear. Instead of beginning with metaphysics, it often began with stress. Instead of beginning with salvation, it began with attention. Instead of beginning with dogma, it began with observation. That made it portable. Mindfulness could move into therapy rooms, hospitals, schools, corporate settings, sports psychology, prisons, apps, podcasts, and everyday life. You no longer had to enter a monastery to learn something contemplative. You could hear about mindfulness from a therapist, a neuroscientist, a teacher, a physician, or a friend. And because of that, many people who might have never walked into a formal religious setting began encountering practices that were at their core deeply spiritual in character, even if they did not call them spiritual. So what exactly did mindfulness give modern spirituality? I think it gave at least 4 major gifts. First, it restored the importance of practice. Modern people often drown in ideas. Mindfulness reminded us that transformation is not just about having the right concepts. It is about training attention, training perception, training the heart. Second, mindfulness helped reawaken the sacredness of the present moment, not as a slogan, not as a cliche, but as a lived discovery. That so much of life is missed because we are elsewhere, remembering, predicting, reacting, narrating, and comparing. Mindfulness helped many people see that reality is not only something to think about, it is something to actually meet. Third, mindfulness made spirituality more experiential and, in some ways, more democratic. You did not need to be a scholar. You did not need to master theology. You did not need perfect language for the mystery. You could begin where you are, with this breath, this body, this emotion, this restless mind, this ordinary moment. And fourth, mindfulness brought compassion into sharper focus, because when people truly become more aware of their own mind, they often begin to notice just how much suffering is moving through them and through everyone else. Mindfulness at its best does not just make us calmer, it makes us less automatic, less identified with every passing thought, less trapped in reactivity, and that can create space for patience, humility, kindness, and care. In that sense, mindfulness did not only modernize spirituality, it humanized it. But every gain comes with questions, and if we are being honest, mindfulness also changed spirituality in ways that deserve scrutiny. Because when mindfulness entered mainstream culture, it was often simplified, stripped down, and detached from the larger ethical and philosophical worlds that originally held it. In some settings, mindfulness became less about awakening and more about optimization, less about liberation from a toxic ego, and more about performing better inside systems that exhaust us, less about compassion and wisdom, and more about self-management. And this is where the conversation gets important, because mindfulness can help us cope, but spirituality at its deepest is not only about coping. It is about transformation. It is about truth, about love, about freedom, about what it means to live well, about how we relate to suffering, mortality, other people, and reality itself. So if mindfulness becomes only a tool for stress reduction, it may remain helpful, but it can also become smaller than what it truly is. A breathing technique is not the same thing as a path of wisdom. Calm is not the same thing as awakening. Attention alone, without ethics or compassion, can become strangely incomplete. And so the great challenge of mindfulness in modern spirituality is this: how do we keep its accessibility without flattening its depth? How do we welcome its psychological benefits without losing its spiritual seriousness? But perhaps the deepest way mindfulness changed modern spirituality is even more profound than all of that. Mindfulness changed where many people now look for the sacred, not only above them, not only beyond them, not only in a distant heaven, a distant doctrine, or a distant authority, but within the field of awareness itself, within presence, within direct experience, within the mystery of consciousness meeting the moment. That is a massive shift, because once people begin to discover that peace, insight, spaciousness, and compassion can arise through intimate attention to experience, spirituality begins to feel less like a mere belief in the unseen and more like participation in reality. Not escaping life, but entering it more fully. Not clinging to a second-hand certainty, but becoming more available to what is true. And maybe that is why mindfulness has mattered so much. Because in a distracted age, it offered recollection. In a fragmented age, it offered integration. In an anxious age, it offered steadiness. In an age suspicious of institutions, it offered a path of first-hand encounter. But the invitation now is to go further, not just to be mindful so that we can feel a little better, but to become the kind of people whose attention is so clear, whose presence is so grounded, whose hearts are so available, that wisdom and compassion begin to shape how we actually live. Because the true promise of mindfulness was never merely that we would become calmer, it was that we might become more awake. And from that awakening, perhaps more loving, more honest, more free, more able to meet this world as it really is. So yes, mindfulness changed modern spirituality. It made spirituality more experiential, more accessible, more present-centered, more psychologically informed, more available to people outside traditional religion. But it also leaves us with an important question. Will mindfulness remain a tool for managing modern life? Or will it help reopen the deeper spiritual questions that modern life so often distracts us from? Questions like, what is awareness? What is freedom? What is compassion? What is a good life? And how shall we live now that we are paying attention? If this reflection resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think mindfulness has deepened modern spirituality or diluted it? And where has mindfulness shown up in your own life? If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might appreciate it. And as always, thank you for being a part of the Wisdom and Compassion community.